even had the audacity to add a little handwritten note at the bottom of the invoice. "Be thankful I'm giving you the opportunity to contribute, Dad." Most fathers would be honored. $212,000. That's what my son thought my love was worth. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the city of Edmonton. I poured concrete foundations for half the overpasses on the Henday. I worked overtime through 2 recessions, through the winters that cracked your knuckles, just walking to the truck. Through the year my wife got sick, and I still showed up, because someone had to keep the lights on. I did all of that for my family. For my son. His name is Preston. He's 31 now, though on the day he handed me that invoice, he felt like a stranger wearing my son's face. Let me back up. My wife, Carol, passed away 7 years ago. Ovarian cancer. It was fast, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Preston was 24 at the time, already out of the house, working in marketing in Calgary. He came back for the funeral, stayed a week, then went back to his life. I understood. Grief does different things to different people. I didn't hold it against him. What I did not understand, and still don't fully understand, is how the man I raised, the boy I coached in hockey, drove to math tutoring in Sherwood Park, helped move into 3 different apartments, became someone capable of what he eventually did to me. I think it started with Melissa. He met her about 4 years ago at some industry conference in Vancouver. She's from West Vancouver originally. Her family has money, real money, the kind that comes with a certain attitude about people who don't. Her father, Raymond, runs a private equity firm out of downtown Vancouver. Her mother, Diane, does charity work and lunches and very little else, as far as I can tell. They're not bad people exactly. They're just people who never had to worry about anything, and that tends to narrow a person's imagination considerably. I met Melissa for the first time at Christmas, about 3 years ago. Preston drove her up to Edmonton, and we had dinner at my house, the same house he grew up in, the 3-bedroom bungalow in Millwoods that Carol and I bought in 1904. I cooked a roast. I set the table properly. I was nervous, honestly. The way you get nervous when you want someone to like you and you know you're being evaluated. Melissa was polite, professionally polite. The kind of polite that has a slight chill underneath it. Like a hotel lobby in January, she complimented my house in a way that didn't quite feel like a compliment. Something about how cozy it was, how she'd always found older homes to have so much character. Preston laughed along like this was charming instead of condescending. After dinner, while Melissa was in the bathroom, Preston pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, almost apologetically, "She's used to a certain kind of lifestyle, Dad, just so you know." I didn't know what to do with that, so I said nothing. The visits became less frequent after that. Preston started making excuses. They were busy. They were traveling. Melissa had family obligations. In 2 years, I saw my son 4 times in person. We talk on the phone, but the conversations got shorter, more transactional. "How are you? I'm fine, okay? Talk soon." I told myself it was just what happened when your kids built their own lives. I told myself that was normal. Then he called me in February, about 18 months ago, to tell me he and Melissa were engaged. I said congratulations. I meant it. I asked when and where, and he said they were thinking September, in Kelowna, at a winery his future in-laws had partially booked out. I said that sounded beautiful. I asked what I could do to help. He said he'd get back to me on that. He got back to me 6 weeks later, not with a phone call, but with a document. A detailed, itemized document sent as a PDF attachment to an email with the subject line, "Dad, wedding contribution." I opened it at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with my coffee going cold beside me. It was 12 pages long. The first page was a cover letter, on what appeared to be actual letterhead. I don't know whose idea that was, but someone had put genuine effort into making this look official. It explained that Preston and Melissa were planning what they called a destination celebration weekend in Kelowna. Rehearsal dinner Friday, ceremony and reception Saturday, brunch Sunday. 140 guests, the winery venue, a catering company out of Vancouver, a florist from West Van, a photographer who apparently shot for Vogue once, a string quartet for the ceremony, a DJ for the reception, and 2 nights of accommodation blocks at the Delta in downtown Kelowna for out-of-town guests. The remaining 11 pages were the itemized costs. The total, before tax, was $212,000. At the bottom of page 12, in my son's handwriting, was that note. "Be thankful I'm giving you the opportunity to contribute, Dad." Most fathers would be honored. I sat at that table for a long time. I looked out the window at the backyard where Preston used to play street hockey with the neighbor kids. I looked at the spot by the fence where Carol had planted her perennial garden, the one that still comes up every spring in the same colors she chose 30 years ago, even though she's been gone for 7. I didn't cry. I was past the point of crying about Preston by then, but something clarified for me in that moment, the way cold water clarifies the air. I understood, finally and completely, that my son had become someone else entirely, and I understood that I had a decision to make. Here is what most people don't know about me. I'm not a loud man. I never have been. Carol used to say I process things like a river, slow on the surface, fast underneath. I don't make scenes. I don't send angry emails. What I do when someone underestimates me is think very carefully about what I actually have and what they actually want. What I had was significant. Carol and I had been disciplined our whole lives. We'd paid off the Edmonton house in 2008. I'd maxed my pension contributions every year. We put money into a joint investment account that, after Carol passed, became mine alone, and which I'd grown quietly over 7 years with the help of a financial advisor I trusted completely. I also had the lake house in Pigeon Lake, bought in 2001, which had appreciated enormously and which I'd never mortgaged. What Preston wanted, what Preston and Melissa, and, I suspected, Raymond and Diane wanted, was access to those assets. The wedding was just the opening bid. I called my lawyer, a woman named Patricia, who'd handled our estate planning for 15 years. I told her what happened. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Walter, I think it's time we talked about the structure of your estate." We talked for 2 hours. Over the following 3 weeks, I made some changes, not dramatic changes, nothing that would appear retaliatory or legally questionable, simply prudent restructuring that I should have done years earlier. The lake house went into a trust. The investment account was reorganized with specific beneficiary designations. I reviewed and updated my will with language that was airtight and specific. Patricia drafted everything carefully, making sure every document reflected my genuine intentions rather than a reaction to a specific incident. When it was done, Patricia said, "Whatever you decide to do about the wedding, your assets are protected." I said, "I'm not going to the wedding." She paused. "You're sure?" I said, "I haven't been invited. I've only been billed." I wrote my son a reply. I kept it short. I told him I received his document. I told him I wished him and Melissa every happiness. I told him I would not be contributing to the wedding financially and that I would not be attending. I told him my door was always open if he ever wanted to talk, father to son, without an invoice involved. I said I loved him. I hit send. His response came 4 hours later. It was not short. He accused me of being selfish. He said I was embarrassing him in front of Melissa's family. He said Carol would be ashamed of me. And that one landed. I won't pretend it didn't, because he knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote it. He said I had more than enough money to contribute, and that my refusal was deliberate cruelty. He said if I didn't reconsider within the week, he would have no choice but to reconsider our relationship entirely. I read the email twice, then I printed it, put it in a folder, and set the folder on my desk. I did not reconsider. The week passed, then 2 weeks, then a month. Preston did not call. I did not call Preston. The silence between us was heavy and familiar, the way silence gets when both people are waiting for the other to break first. I kept myself busy. I have a good life in Edmonton. Friends from work, from the community. A Tuesday night poker game that's been running for 11 years. I volunteered that spring at a Habitat for Humanity build in Spruce Grove, which gave me something useful to do with my hands and my head. I thought about Preston every day, the way you think about a sore tooth. Constantly, without wanting to. In June, about 6 weeks before the wedding, I got a phone call from Raymond. I hadn't spoken to Melissa's father more than twice in my life. He had one of those voices that sounds permanently, slightly impatient, like he was calling from between 2 important meetings. He told me, without much preamble, that he and Diane were concerned about the situation. He said the wedding planning was well underway and that my absence was creating a family optics problem. He suggested I reconsider my position and that perhaps I'd misunderstood what the original communication from Preston had intended to convey. I let him finish. Then I said calmly and clearly that I had not misunderstood anything. I said my son had sent me an invoice demanding I pay a specific sum to attend his wedding as a guest, and that I had declined. I said I wished Preston and Melissa well. I said I hoped the wedding was everything they'd planned. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is going to cause problems." I said, "With respect, Raymond, it already has." He hung up. The wedding happened on a Saturday in September. I know because Preston had not removed me from some group text thread, so I received photos in real time. The winery, the vines, the table settings, Melissa in her dress, Preston in his suit looking happy in the way people look happy when they're performing happiness for a camera. I put my phone in a drawer and went fishing at Pigeon Lake. I caught 2 wally and ate them for dinner on the deck as the sun went down over the water. I let myself feel sad that night. Not angry, just sad. Sad for the father I'd tried to be, and for the distance between that trying and what had actually resulted. Sad for Carol, who would have known what to say to Preston in a way I never could. Sad for the version of this story where things had gone differently. Then I went to bed. What happened next, I genuinely did not anticipate. About 3 weeks after the wedding, I received a call from Patricia. She told me she'd been contacted by a lawyer representing Melissa's family, specifically Raymond, regarding the estate planning changes I'd made earlier that spring. Raymond had apparently learned through Preston that I'd restructured my assets and had concluded that this restructuring had somehow been directed at Melissa personally. He was threatening a legal claim, something about expectation of inheritance, and what the lawyer called a reasonable reliance argument. The idea being that Preston had allegedly told Melissa she would benefit from my estate, and that my restructuring had constituted a kind of fraud. Patricia told me this was, legally speaking, not a serious claim. He'd have to prove that you made representations to Melissa directly, which you didn't, and my fiancé told me his father was rich, is not a legal basis for anything, she said. But she also said it wasn't free to defend, and that Raymond was clearly hoping I'd settle to make it go away. I said, "Let him file it." Patricia said, "Are you absolutely certain?" I said, "Patricia, I restructured my estate because it was the right time to do so. I was 62 years old, with no updated will and significant assets. Any prudent person would have done the same. The fact that my son's wedding happened to coincide with that timing is entirely coincidental." She laughed, just slightly. "Okay," she said, "I'll draft the response." Raymond's lawyer filed a notice of claim in BC Supreme Court in October. Patricia responded with a comprehensive factual record, the timeline of our estate planning consultations, which predated Preston's engagement by over 2 years, the documented reasons for each change, and a clear legal argument that an adult child's expectation of inheritance, communicated secondhand by that adult child to a third party, creates no actionable claim against a living parent. The claim was dismissed in January without proceeding to trial. Raymond's legal fees, Patricia estimated, had run somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. I received a text from Preston the day after the dismissal. It said, "I hope you're happy." I didn't reply. What I did do about a month later was send Preston a letter. A real letter, on paper, in an envelope mailed to his address in Calgary. I told him I wasn't happy. I told him that none of what had happened in the past 18 months had made me happy, and that happiness wasn't what I'd been after. I told him I had spent 63 years trying to build something honest, a career, a marriage, a family, and that I had refused to be diminished in the final chapters of my own story by an invoice and a note about gratitude. I told him his mother would not have been ashamed of me. I told him she would have been heartbroken, but not ashamed, and that there was a significant difference. I told him I still loved him, that this had never been in question, that love, in my experience, does not require you to accept mistreatment, and that the two things can coexist. You can love someone and refuse to fund the performance of a life built on contempt for you. I said the door was still open. Same as before. He hasn't walked through it yet. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't. I've stopped predicting what Preston will do. What I know is this. I'm still in my house in Millwoods. Carol's perennials came up again this May. The same coral and yellow they've always been. I'm going fishing again next weekend at Pigeon Lake with a friend from the Habitat Build, a retired schoolteacher from St. Albert who has terrible luck with Wally and fantastic stories about growing up in Cape Breton. I'm 63 years old. I built things that are still standing. I loved a woman for 26 years and held her hand at the end. I raised a son who, somewhere underneath the person he has become, is still the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder watching Hockey Night in Canada. I'm still here. The door is still open, and the check, the one my son assumed I would eventually write, is still in my account. I keep thinking about that Tuesday morning, the coffee going cold, the 12-page PDF, the handwritten note at the bottom that Preston thought was clever. What I've come to understand, sitting with all of it over these past months, is that the outcomes in this story weren't random. They followed a logic, not dramatic, not poetic in the Hollywood sense, just the plain logic of how actions accumulate into consequences over time. Raymond spent $40,000 to $60,000 on a legal claim that had no foundation, because he assumed I was the kind of man who could be pressured into capitulation. He was wrong, and the bill for being wrong was substantial. Preston lost his father's presence at his wedding, lost any financial inheritance he might have expected, and gained a marriage that began with a lawsuit because he chose entitlement over relationship. These things didn't happen to them. They built them, one decision at a time, and I built my outcome too. Not through anger, I want to be clear about that. What protected me wasn't rage or spite, it was something quieter. It was 31 years of showing up honestly, of not cutting corners on my Henday overpasses, or on my tax returns, or on the hard conversations with Carol when we disagreed. Integrity, I've always believed, is mostly invisible until the moment you actually need it. The work Patricia and I did in those 3 weeks, the trust, the restructuring, the airtight documentation, that work held up in court because it was real. It had been real for years before Preston ever sent that invoice. You can't manufacture that kind of foundation in a crisis. You either built it over a lifetime or you didn't. The second thing that protected me was being willing to think clearly when I most wanted to react emotionally. When Preston wrote that his mother would have been ashamed of me, some part of me wanted to pick up the phone and say things I couldn't take back. I didn't. I printed the email, put it in a folder, and called Patricia instead. That's not coldness. I want to be careful here, because people sometimes confuse composure with indifference. I was not indifferent. I was heartbroken, but I'd lived long enough to know that the decisions you make in the first hour after a wound are rarely the decisions you choose in the light of the following week. The third thing, and this is the one I think about most, is that I didn't quit. Not on the legal process, not on writing that letter to Preston, not on fishing at Pigeon Lake or showing up to the Habitat Build in Spruce Grove or going to Tuesday Poker with men who've known me for over a decade. There's a particular kind of courage required, not in grand moments, but in the ordinary ones, in continuing to be yourself, quietly, when someone has tried to reduce you to a transaction. Preston sent me an invoice. I refused to become one. I don't know what happens next with my son. I genuinely don't. The door is open. It has been open every single day since I sent that reply. Whether he walks through it is a choice only he can make, and I stopped trying to make it for him. What I do know is that I'm still here, still in the house in Millwoods, still watching Carol's perennials come up every spring in the same coral and yellow she chose. Still myself. That turned out to be enough.